Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this week. I'm Liz Mangus, Literacy Specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. We have a great session for you today. This is the last of our spring webinars this year, so we'll be moving into a little bit of a break after this one, but we are very, very excited. We have a first-time Saddleback webinar presenter today with Dr. Ann Monroe, and we are very excited that at the end of a long school year, you are still hopping on the live broadcast and you are still joining and engaging with us. So thank you to those of you who are signing in right now, and to all of you who catch the recording later, we appreciate you. As usual, your control bar for this webinar will be located at the bottom of your web browser window, and that is where you will find the live transcript, the Q&A, and the chat icons. If you would like to take advantage of subtitles, to do that, you will need to select live transcript and then show subtitles. As we go throughout the session today, if you have questions, either for Saddleback or Dr. Monroe, you can put those in the Q&A. And then, of course, we always want you to chat with us. So if you could go to the chat and select everyone from the dropdown and let everyone know where you are signing in from today, that would be great. And then, of course, we are on Twitter. Saddleback is on Twitter, and the School of Education at the University of Mississippi is also on Twitter. Go ahead and follow us, say hello, let everybody know you are joining us for this session today. All right, we've got a few people hopping in already. Hello, Robert, welcome. So for those of you who are hopping in right now, if you could go to the chat, select everyone from the dropdown, and let us know where you are signing in from today. And if you could, let us know what you teach and what your role is as well. We had a lot of people from different walks of the education circuit sign up for this. So I'd like to know who's joining us live today. Hi, Laura. Thank you for joining us today. Hi, David, research librarian. Okay. Hello, Ruben. Thank you very much for joining us today. It should be interesting to see how many. Oh, Laura's an ESL K-12 teacher. Thank you, Laura. So we had many ESL teachers sign up for this, but we have Victoria here, a school psychologist. Thank you so much. And Linda as well. Okay, Melissa says kindergarten teacher. Welcome, everybody. All right, thank you so much. Let's see, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Let's say hi to Dr. Monroe. Hi, Ann, how are you today?
Good. Hello, everybody. Hello, Liz. Good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So the way this all started is there was an Ed Week article back in, I want to say it was January or February. They published it's a 4-part series, I guess. There were 4 separate articles around struggling middle schoolers and high schoolers. And you were quoted in one of them talking about shame and the role of that, and making sure that we set the tone in the environment to help students. And I saw that and I thought that would be a great conversation to have on our webinar series. So a little bit different than what we normally cover in terms of topics here, but I know that our audience will be interested and make the connections to what it is they do in their classroom with their students. So thank you for joining us and for being willing to work with us. We definitely appreciate it.
Absolutely. Always happy to share, and hopefully people can pick up on some things that will help them in their classrooms or in their schools, and hopefully I can learn from others as well.
And then for those of you who are hopping in, we really welcome, as you are listening and participating in the content today, as you are as things are resonating with you, and as you are noticing points that you can make a connection to in your own practice, we would love if you could let us know about that in the chat. We have a nice cross-section of people here from education. It would be great to see how this information is striking you and how it shows up in your day-to-day practice too. We're definitely interested in your contributions as we go today. So, all right, it's about time to get started. Hi, Bonnie. It's about time to get started. Our topic is a place of pride. We are here to talk about creating a shame-free classroom. So to lead us in this conversation, we have Anne Monroe. She is the Assistant Dean, Director of Assessment, and Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of Mississippi. And before her time there, she was a third grade teacher with the Hamilton County School System in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Dr. Monroe teaches a variety of courses, including education foundations, curriculum development, and assessment. Her research focuses on how teachers can promote pride and minimize shame in their classroom activities and lessons. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks for being here, everyone. And I'm going to let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And thanks for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and I've got a presentation I'm going to pull up. One thing I wanted everybody to know that if you've got questions or comments as we are, as I'm working through the PowerPoint, please put those in the chat as we're going. And Liz has generously volunteered to monitor the chat. I am terrible at monitoring the chat while also presenting. So that's, while I can multitask in a lot of other ways as a former third grade teacher, the chat is not my best area for monitoring a chat and also presenting at the same time. So Liz is going to monitor that chat. If you've got things that are coming up, or if you need a clarification on something I'm saying during the presentation, or even just have a point of discussion during the presentation, I encourage Liz to please interrupt me and we'll have a conversation. So she'll kind of monitor the chat during, and then of course we'll have time for questions and things at the end, but please feel free to interrupt during the presentation with a question or comment. So as Liz said, I'm here to talk about a place of pride, creating a shame-free classroom, and just talking about what are these areas in school. And in this case in particular, we're going to talk about struggling readers, where kids, where there's some opportunities for kids to fall into a cycle of shame, and what we can do to break that cycle and create places of pride in the classroom. So to start, we really need to determine, what is it we're talking about? What is shame? What's the definition that we're using when we talk about shame? And so shame is generally viewed as a private, self-conscious experience in which individuals feel that a weakness or vulnerability has been exposed, not only to others, but also to themselves, leaving them feeling deficient and humiliated. When we talk about shame, we're really talking about shame as one of the 9 primary affects or emotions as defined by Sylvan Tompkins. He's a psychologist. And so Tompkins defined emotion or affects. He said there are 9 innate affects. So meaning innate, that we're all born with the ability to experience these affects. If you look at the image I have here, you see that there are 2 positive affects: enjoyment, joy, and interest, excitement. There are 6 negative affects: shame, humiliation, distress, anguish, disgust, fear, terror, anger, rage, and dismell. Dismell is a weird one because it's, when you smell something and you kind of cringe up your nose, that's an actual innate emotion or affect that Tompkins has identified. And there's one neutral affect, surprise or startle, where sort of there are no positive or negative feelings associated, just sort of almost a cleansing of the mind. You're just startled and surprised, and the reaction is just that of surprise. It's neither negative or positive. But if you look at this sort of spread of emotion, you see that the 2 positive emotions there's only 2 positive and then 6 negative ones that we are constantly navigating through in this one neutral one. And so shame, or humiliation, as Tompkins would describe it, shame, humiliation, is one of the 9 innate affects. And so everyone experiences shame at one time or the other. Some people experience more shame than others, and for different reasons. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. When one experiences shame, Donald Nathanson, who worked directly with Sylvan Tompkins and then ran the Sylvan Tompkins Institute, he talks about the compass of shame. And I think this is a really important thing to look at, particularly for those of us that are working in classrooms or working with children. When someone experiences shame, especially repeated shame, we tend to take one of these 4 pathways in order to cope with that negative emotion. And so one of the pathways is the withdrawal pathway. If we experience shame, we tend to draw back, isolate ourselves, hide from that emotion. Because it's a negative emotion and not something pleasant to feel, we may withdraw from the experience that's creating the shame. In a classroom, you may see children who don't participate, who sort of sink down in their desk when they may feel shame around something that they're dealing with. Another pathway is the attack self pathway. When people feel, this is usually with repeated shame, people may do an attack self pathway. This would be like putting themselves down. I'm not good enough. I can't do this. Or to extreme effects, sometimes there's cutting or things like that with severe types of experiences with shame. Another pathway that Nathanson defines is avoidance. And we see this in the classroom a lot, where students will just avoid a situation in order to not experience the shame. If you look at students, and we're going to talk a little bit about mathematics in a minute, if you look at kids who feel shame around their math ability, they will just avoid higher levels of mathematics as they get older and not enroll in certain higher levels of mathematics. There can be denial with people who have repeated shame around certain serious issues. There may be a drug abuse. This is a way, or alcohol, abuse of alcohol. It's a way to avoid the feeling because you're drowning out the feeling with those substances. And then the last pathway is the attack other pathway. And a lot of psychologists talk about this as one of the issues with violence in our society, with people feeling shame, repeated shame around things, and they will lash out at others. So it's kind of the opposite of attacking yourself. You're lashing out at others, almost turning the tables, lashing out verbally or physically at others because of the shame you're feeling. And so these pathways are pathways that people take when they feel shame. And you can see that in a classroom, these can be very problematic. So you want to avoid shame when possible in a classroom setting and promote pride, because these pathways end up being very negative in what happens with folks. So every aspect of human development elicits either a sense of pride and accomplishment or a sense of shame in the perceived failure. So if you think about that, it's like a shame pride axis, if you will. So whatever experience we have, all sorts of aspects of our development as human beings, particularly in a classroom setting when we're developing and learning and growing, we either can have a sense of pride in what we're doing and our accomplishments, or we may feel a sense of shame in our perceived failure. And if you think about our schools and how we set up schools and how we structure schools, a lot of times we're in a school setting where there's not room for failure, which I think is really unfortunate, that our schools are set up in a way where, we see failure as a problem, or risk-taking can be a problem, when in actuality, it's risk-taking and failure is the fertile ground for learning. And so I think the shame pride axis is a really interesting one to look at. So we can look at the shame pride triggers. What is it that triggers either pride or shame? What are these developmental triggers? Aspects of size and strengths. Researchers have shown that aspects of our size, our strength, can be areas where we either feel pride or shame. Dexterity and skill. And you see, obviously, these things are apparent when you're in a classroom. We can either feel pride in our skill, our ability to do things, or shame in our perceived lack of ability. Dependence versus independence can trigger pride and shame. And what we mean by dependence versus independence is kind of going back to Erik Erikson's look at the 8 stages of man, or psychosocial stages of development. We're talking about, do we feel like we have autonomy over our lives? Do we feel like we have enough independence to be able to take action on our situation? We want to have children who develop a sense of independence, but we also don't want to give them too much independence, because we want to give them support. So it's this sort of struggle between balancing dependence and independence. And if we have a great balance where children who are developing feel like they have a lot of independence, but some nice structure and guidance, they develop a sense of pride in what they're doing. If we either do not allow them to have any independence, we're constantly restricting them or putting our thumb on them or over controlling them, then they feel like they're dependent and they can develop a sense of shame. Or on the other end, if we have no structure at all and they have too much independence, they don't know where to go and they can feel shame in that way as well. So that's what dependence and independence means in terms of the shame pride triggers. Gender identity and sexuality can be a trigger for shame. And so those are issues we see a lot, especially with bullying and teasing and the way that society, some members of society view people that are different in terms of gender or sexuality, or don't fit to what, fit into what they consider the norm. Also, interpersonal bridge. This is here, when we develop relationships with others, we develop what Kaufman has called the interpersonal bridge. And so interpersonal bridges are essential to a healthy development. We know that with parents and caregivers of young children, that interpersonal connection is vital to growth and development. We know in the classroom that interpersonal bridge or relationship with teachers and peers is vital to children's growth and development. So when we build healthy relationships and when the interpersonal bridge is strong and there's a feeling of trust and mutual respect and admiration, we foster a sense of pride. When we have relationships that are fraught with discourse or negative feelings or betrayal of trust, we can foster a feeling of shame in students. And if you look at these triggers, these shame pride triggers, size and strength, dexterity and skill, dependence versus independence, gender identity and sexuality, interpersonal bridge, those relationships we're building, you see that all of these play a role in school. Students bring their entire self to school. They bring everything that they are, everything that they hope to become to school. And so we're dealing with these triggers in a school setting all the time. So not just at home, but also at school. Some of the research that I've done is looked at particularly shame and shame triggers in a school setting. So the slide before was talking about generally the shame pride axis. What do we find ourselves feeling pride or shame about? But the research that I've done over the last I guess really 15 years, has looked at school-induced, what I call school-induced shame. So some of the things that trigger shame in a school setting that I've found through my research, and these are in order of the most reported shame triggers in the research that I've done. And the first one is very disturbing. It's insensitive or hostile teachers is the #1 reported trigger of shame for children in a school setting. And that is very disturbing, particularly in my role as someone who works in an institution that's training people to be teachers. We want to make sure that not only are we recruiting the right people to the profession, people that have the right dispositions to work with children and the right skills and knowledge to work with children, but how are we training them to deal with the emotional aspects of children and what they need in the school setting. So insensitive or hostile teachers is the #1 reported trigger of shame, school-induced shame. Academic struggles, this seems like an obvious one, right? So academic struggles, when students struggle, they're naming this as one of the main triggers of shame in the school setting. Peer teasing and bullying is also a big shame trigger in the school setting. Physical differences. So the way that people look, it could be any sort of physical difference, could be the color of their skin, the way their body looks, a body size, body type, maybe a disability that's obvious in the physical sense is also seen as a shame trigger for students in a classroom setting. And then lastly, teacher apathy. This is different from insensitive or hostile teachers in the way that the participants in the research that I've been conducting define it. Teacher apathy, these are teachers who, not necessarily insensitive or hostile, but just not providing the assistance needed for a student who is struggling. And the fact that they are not getting what they need from the teacher triggers, I think, this break in the interpersonal bridge we talked about earlier, and thus a feeling of shame. Obviously, being insensitive or hostile also is a break in that interpersonal bridge. So you see some of these connections between the list before and the slide before, and some of these things that are showing up in my research particularly about school-induced shame. Liz, did you have a
Yes.
comment or question?
As you were talking, I put a note in the chat about the insensitive or hostile teachers being kind of surprising and concerning. And a few people chimed in that, they agreed with that sentiment. So my question is, in your research, did you find that the insensitivity was kind of like unconscious, like the teachers weren't necessarily aware that their actions were being received in that way? And is this a question of, I guess, increasing awareness around interpersonal actions? So.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because it has come up a lot in the work that I'm doing. And so the answer is both. There's just straight out, just outright obvious hostility and insensitivity that anyone would define as hostile and insensitive. But then in the research that I'm doing, it's really important that we're talking about the perceptions of the students.
Right.
Because emotion is perception. And so if the perception is that the teacher is being insensitive or hostile, the effect is the same, regardless of what the teacher's intention is. And so that brings into what you're talking about with the training, how important the training is. What things are seen as insensitive, even if the teacher's intent is not to be insensitive, the effect is the same for the student. And so when we study emotion, it's all about the perception, the individual's perception of what's happening to them, not necessarily what the other person's intent was. And so that actually was something that came up very early on in my research, almost an argument between some of my colleagues about, well, they didn't mean to be insensitive. It doesn't matter, because the effect's the same. So, but how do we deal with that in a reality situation about training and preventing? And it's about looking at what are these things that people are perceiving as insensitive. So I'd say in my research, there's a mix of both outright hostility and unintentional insensitivity, or what students perceive as insensitive or even hostile. So, I hope that answers the question. But I think it's, something that we constantly have to look at. But when we're talking about emotions, it almost doesn't matter what the intent is, but it does matter when we're working to solve the problem and training folks about what is it that students are perceiving as hostile and insensitive.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So if we have these shame triggers, what research is showing us is happening to students and what's triggering the emotion of shame inside of them. What's happening to them when they feel this emotion? What is the effect of that shame on the student? And you see that this is also from research that I've done with school-induced shame. We see, and these are also in the order of most reported effects of school-induced shame. Hiding, avoidance, and withdrawal are the top effects that students report when they feel shame in the classroom. And you see this direct connection between Nathanson's pathways of shame, or compass of shame, and these reports from the students. They hide, they avoid what it is that's causing them the shame, and they withdraw from the situation. Diminish self-worth. A lot of the participants in my studies have talked about a feeling of diminished self-worth, and not feeling good about themselves, and not feeling that they're worthy. And then there's also reports, while much fewer than the other two effects of school-induced shame, is the tendency to overcompensate. And this can actually, and psychologists have talked about how the tendency to overcompensate, and some people talk about perfectionists, is actually a type of avoidance. If you talk about Nathanson's pathways of shame, overcompensating in another area, or being a perfectionist, is actually a way to avoid the feeling of shame, because you're trying to avoid whatever it is that's causing you shame by overcompensating in other areas, or being a perfectionist and trying not to have that any kind of light on anything that is perceived to be something that you're not good at, or whatever it is. So these are the effects of shame, and they can be very detrimental. If you think about a classroom setting, when students are hiding from something, avoiding a learning task, or withdrawing from the classroom environment, all of these things, hiding, avoidance, and withdrawal, will produce, a diminished amount of learning, diminished amount of participation in classroom activity. And so we want to make sure that we minimize shame in the classroom, because we want students to get the most out of what we're doing in school so they can grow and develop and become the best that they can be. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about that I thought might interest some folks is another area of research that I've been working on, which is what I call the shame paradox. And so with the shame paradox, I'm looking at the difference between shame in the area of mathematics and shame in the area of reading. And so a lot of you've probably, either you are someone who's done this, or someone who said this, when adults or older people are very apt and willing to share how they're so terrible at mathematics. And I can guarantee everybody on here has either heard this or said this themselves, like, oh, I'm terrible at math, I can't do mathematics. Yet you do not hear people publicly announcing their failure to read. You don't hear people saying, oh, I'm illiterate, and laughing about it or whatever. It's a very different, it's a paradox, that's for sure. So if we look at mathematics and reading, we've got two core subject areas in school that are really important. We have students in both areas who experience struggle. We have students who struggle in the mathematics classroom. We have students who experience struggle in the reading classroom. Where these two diverge, and where I think what's happening with this fact that as people get older, they have no problem, they have no shame associated with mathematics. Because if we know shame creates this need to want to hide the weakness, but if you're publicly announcing that you're terrible at math and it's, talking about it, you don't really have a sense of shame about it anymore. But you still have a sense of shame about your inability to read as you get older. So I think where the break is that eventually, when students reach a certain age, they start to see mathematics as something done by others, mathematicians, scientists, something done by people who are good at math. They can sort of almost divorce themselves from the mathematics or the struggle by saying, I'm not a math person. But that's very hard to do in reading. It's also actually not true about mathematics. Everyone's a mathematician. Everyone's a person of mathematics, a math person, if you will. But people have this ability to say they're not, that it's something done by others. In reading, however, reading is so tied to our identity and used in every aspect of life, just like math is, but it's more commonly seen as something that's done by all. And so that's the break. If something is seen or perceived as something that everyone should be doing, then we continue to have a feeling of shame around our inability to do that thing. If we see, like in mathematics, that something we can't do is really something others do, we don't have to do it, we don't have to be good at it, it's not the norm, then we can say that we don't have a sense of shame about that, because it's really not something that I'm supposed to be necessarily good at. And hence, when we have this separation in mathematics, we have a willingness to announce a lack of ability, and hence the feeling of not really feeling shame around it to a certain extent once we get old enough. In reading, however, that break doesn't happen. We see reading as done by all. We are not willing to announce our lack of ability, and hence we want to hide our lack of ability, and shame is a result. And as you've seen, shame is very destructive. And we'll take one of those 4 pathways to alleviate the feeling of shame, and those pathways lead to nothing good. So we want to avoid shame. We really want, and the struggle and I'm working with one of my colleagues really closely, who's a mathematics educator, looking at, we want students to feel like they're a mathematician, but we want to avoid shame. So we're looking at, how do we foster a feeling that everyone's a doer of mathematics, everyone should, that there's, pride in experienced struggle, and that there's to celebrate the struggle of mathematics and to feel like we're a doer, but also to avoid shame. And so we're looking at strategies in the mathematics classroom to bring everyone in as a mathematician, but also to avoid shame. We don't want to create a sense of shame. We want to avoid shame, but we don't want to avoid shame by having people say they're not mathematicians. So that's kind of what we're working on there. But there's definitely this paradox between mathematics and reading and people's willingness to share their abilities in those areas. One thing that's really important to understand about struggling readers and shame is this idea of toxic shame. We all experience shame at one time or another. But toxic shame is when we have this repeated exposure to shame about the same thing. And the more we're exposed exposed to the feeling, the more toxic it becomes and the more serious the effect. So toxic shame, while most of us experience shame at one time or another, those who are repeatedly exposed to shame tend to suffer the most negative consequences. Students who struggle to read are vulnerable to toxic shame due to the repeated exposure of their struggle to others and to themselves. So if you're a struggling reader and you're in a school setting and you're constantly being asked to read aloud, or your struggle to read is front and center for everyone to see, you are repeatedly exposed to shame. It can become toxic and very detrimental. The other thing about shame that's so dangerous is that we don't even have to have an other person to be the one is seeing our weakness. That other, that I that sees our weakness that we want to avoid could be ourselves. So the inner I, if we feel like that we are diminished in some way, then we're constantly shaming ourselves. And so if you think about that pathway of attacking yourself, shame becomes very toxic, because obviously if that outside other is seeing your struggle, you feel shame, but you can also be your inner eye, seeing yourself as someone who's struggling, and that becomes a way of self-shaming yourself, if you will. So toxic shame is definitely apparent with those that struggle to read. So how do we break this cycle of shame with struggling readers? That's what we're going to spend the next 3 slides talking about, and hopefully you've got some ideas to share as well. How do we create a place of pride for struggling readers in our classrooms, regardless of what we teach? Whether we are an English, whether we're a reading teacher, we work with English language learners, or we work with a broad spectrum of students, or we're working on supporting our students emotionally. How do we create a place of pride in school in general, but also in the classroom for those that struggle with reading? So just some specific strategies, and I'd love to hear some other strategies from those of you that have some that you're using that really help create a sense of pride or promote pride in the classroom. But just some things to think about. You want to empower vulnerability and mistake making. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier about the school setting. Unfortunately, our schools are so structured to see mistakes and failures as something we want to completely avoid, when mistakes and failure are the fertile soil for learning. And so we want to empower our students to be vulnerable and to be open to mistake making, and to celebrate our attempts at something, regardless of whether they lead to what we might consider a mistake or what we might consider a success. And so empowering our students to be vulnerable, this takes time. It also, I feel, takes a community in a school to develop a culture around vulnerability and mistake making, or we might call risk taking. So we want to make sure that we develop this culture of really promoting risk taking, regardless of what happens after we take that risk. Providing scaffolding so students can access grade level content, even if they're not reading at grade level. It's really important. Obviously, we all know that if you're struggling to read and you get into the upper grades, that reading, you're relying on your reading skill to learn other things, other content. That content area reading is really important. And so we don't want to miss out on important content in science and social studies and because of our struggle with decoding or fluency or some of those reading comprehension skills. So we want to provide the scaffolding that students need to read out, grade level content, regardless of what the content is. Flexible grouping is really important. I know historically in our schools in the United States, we've relied on ability grouping. And I know a lot of schools still heavily rely on ability grouping. We have to be very careful about that. There is a time and place for ability grouping, but when we use ability grouping as our kind of set and default grouping strategy, we can create problems for students. Students know what group they're in. They get stuck in these groups for years, and they don't see a way out. And so I think being more flexible with our grouping, using more heterogeneous groups is really important. Occasional homogeneous groups for skill building is obviously really important, but having a lot more use of flexible grouping in whatever setting in school that is really important. Giving struggling readers books that are interesting and age appropriate is really important, while still being accessible in terms of reading level. And these resources are out there. Making sure that students have material in their hands that is age appropriate and interesting while still being accessible in terms of their reading level is really important. Incorporating students' strengths and interests into reading instruction. We know that motivation comes from students being able to build on what they're good at and what they're interested in. Choice is really, really important in the classroom. Choice equals motivation. And when students get to choose what they want to do, they're usually going to choose something that lies in their area, their strong area, or the area in which they're interested in. So incorporating strengths and interests into reading instruction whenever possible is a really great strategy to promote pride and diminish shame. Choral reading. Now I know that obviously when we're working with our students with fluency and building fluency skills, we need to hear them read. They need to practice. But this public reading or popcorn reading, or this is very commonly listed as a source of shame for students who struggle with reading, because it's a public announcement that they have an issue, and this creates a sense of shame. Just like we talked about, people want to hide what they feel they're not good at. And so you can't, this is literally the definition of shame, is this public pronouncement of my weakness. And so choral reading is a way to literally hear students, but also to develop fluency skills. So when we read together as a whole class out loud, the choral reading, we pick up the rhythm, we pick up whether it's rhyme, repetition, rhythm, whatever we're reading, we read with others. It helps with our fluency, and it diminishes the hot spotlight that can cultivate a sense of shame with students. Obviously, if you're going to need to hear students reading, but you take those students who are struggling to the side and work with them one-on-one instead of in a big classroom with others to see where they're weak. This is really important, and something that Sylvan Tompkins talks about with his affect theory is the importance to openly discuss your feelings. And so Tompkins talks about openly discussing all feelings, whether they fall on that negative, neutral, or positive scale of his 9 affects. So discussing all of your feelings, focusing on the positive, and moving forward. And so openly discussing feelings around reading is a really good practice. We don't want to not talk about the negative feelings. We want to talk about the negative feelings, but we want to focus on the positive and then move forward. So openly discussing feelings is also one of those pieces of school culture. Is that something that I'm doing in my classroom with my students? That's the place to start. Is this something that we can do as a grade level? Is this something that we can do as a whole school? How can we build a culture of openly discussing feelings, whether they be positive or negative, but also focusing on the positive feelings? Utilizing nonfiction text when possible is a really great strategy for struggling readers. Nonfiction texts are written differently than fiction. They tend to have shorter, more straightforward sentence structures. They tend to have lots of pictures. They use captions and headings in a way that help guide struggling readers. So utilizing nonfiction text when possible, or pairing a nonfiction text with a fiction piece we're reading with similar themes, or maybe a supportive nonfiction text that has a social studies, historical element that goes with the fiction piece we're reading, can really help students understand the concepts and comprehend the material. Just because that structure of a nonfiction text lends itself to an easier read with, like I said, the inclusion of photos, titles and headings, and captions and things like that. Communicating with other teachers about student strengths and needs. And this is something that just recently, we took a group of students to Finland to study their education system. And something I walked away with, that one of the central differences is that some of the teachers over there will stay with students for multiple years. So if you've taught students 1 year, you may have that same group of students the next year, and maybe even the next if you teach in Finland. And so teachers really get to know the students. And so they're with that student for a long period of time, and they know the student's strengths. They know the student's needs. We tend, unless you're a special ed teacher that works with, maybe students repeatedly year after year, we tend to only see students for 1 year at a time, and then we pass them along to the next teacher. And so it becomes very hard. It's almost like we're starting fresh with a student, and the gains that the student makes, or the way that the teacher gets to know the student, almost just gets thrown aside, and we pass the student along. We need to make sure we're working with each other as teachers, with our peers in our schools, to communicate about our students. Follow those students, especially the ones that are struggling. Reach out to the teachers that are going to be working with them next. Reach out early before they get them. Here's what I'm working on with this student. Introduce the student. Talk about the strengths that student has, and build on the strengths, and communicate that student's strengths with other teachers. A lot of times we talk about the student's weaknesses. I remember getting my class list at the beginning of the year and going to the second grade teachers and saying, tell me about these students. And it was, a lot of that discussion is around the problems instead of the strengths that the students bring. So refocusing that conversation, communicating with other teachers about the strengths, and also obviously about the needs the student has. That's also important. But that communication, it helps to keep that continuum of support for those students. Rely on students' listening, speaking, and visual representation skills to bolster the reading skills. Language arts, there are a lot of them. It's called arts with an S for a reason. Listening, speaking, visual representation, viewing, these are all things that students who may struggle with fluency or decoding skills, they might be really strong in these areas. So thinking about, how do we, support our struggling readers? Can we put this book on tape? Can they read along as, the audio's playing? Can we do some oral exercises, some speaking skills about this text? How can they visualize what they're reading about? How can we use images with the pieces that we're reading? So thinking about all of the language arts when we're working with struggling readers, and how to connect those and use the ones the students are the strongest in to support the areas in which they struggle. Focus on growth, not failure. This is really important. Where are we growing? Goal setting is great for students of all ages, and it's so easy to do. If you have, depending on the age of the child, the younger the child, the more often you want to meet with them. But goal setting, have students set goals. You work with them to set their own goals. Set a couple of goals for reading, for struggling readers. Set a couple of goals you want them to work on. For all students, this works for every student. Set some goals. We know that motivation, just goal setting itself, is motivating. And so focusing on something, having them write it down with you, and then coming back and revisiting it and reflecting on, what are some areas I grew on? Did I grow? did I get close? What can I still work on? And kind of checking back and forth and not forgetting about these really important goal setting meetings we can have with students. Lessening the emphasis on competition. I feel like this is also an area where we can improve generally in our country with education. We have such an emphasis on competition, and it just goes against what we know about human development. Everyone develops differently. They develop at their own pace. And so why we have to bring competition into every aspect of schooling is just beyond me. I don't understand this. I know that competition can be motivational for some, but it's not what growth and development is about. It's not a competition. It's about an individual's endeavor to be their best self. And when you're talking about an individual's endeavor to be their best self, there should be no competition with others. And so lessening that emphasis on competition really helps everyone relax, focus on themselves, and just have a more peaceful existence in the school setting. Decreasing the use of ability grouping, like I talked about before. Obviously, we have to sometimes meet with students who are struggling in certain areas together. That's okay, but not doing it all the time, not keeping students in static groups, making sure we change it up and we use heterogeneous grouping as our default. Listening to what students say and not what we want to hear. And I have to tell myself, this is a reminder all the time for me. I need to listen to what my students are saying, not listening for what I want them to say, not what I want to hear. Because when we listen to what students are saying, we learn a lot more about how they're interpreting what we're talking about in the classroom, where they are with their understanding and their mastery of the skill, and what their needs may be. And so we must be better listeners as teachers. Another way to promote pride is to teach conflict resolution skills to children, talking about keeping those interpersonal bridges strong between peers, between student and teacher, between students and their parents. Teaching conflict resolution helps us grow relationships. And when we grow relationships, we foster pride. And so teaching conflict resolution is a great area to work on if we want to promote pride in our classrooms. Discussing and openly discussing bullying with students, having no tolerance for bullying or mockery or laughing in our classrooms at others' risk-taking. We want to make sure we foster that sense of being okay to try in our classrooms and to feel free to take a risk no matter what the result, whether that be needing to try again or having success. So discussing bullying is really important with students, being very open about it and discussing our feelings around it. And then, of course, recruiting, training, and retaining emotionally attuned teachers. We've got to really promote the idea that emotions are at the center of everything we do with teaching. Emotions are the filters of which we do everything in life. So everything comes through the emotional filter first, and then we act on it. And so if we're not discussing emotions and we're not promoting positive emotions in the school setting, we're not doing our best with our students. So these are just some strategies. I know you've got some to share, and Liz, I'll throw it to you guys for questions or comments or discussion posts, and I'll kind of stop my share and
I wanted to jump in here and mention a few things that have popped into the chat. A few people said, Bonnie said, I model mistakes every day in my class with adult learners. I'm never worried when I make mistakes in my class.
That's so important, that modeling. See, thank you so much for sharing that. Who was it again?
That was Bonnie. Yes.
Bonnie. Yes. Thank you. That modeling piece, modeling is, I talk to my students all the time about modeling is our strongest tool, right? For promoting the good, and whatever it is whatever that good is defined as, good process in mathematics or the best way to talk to others. So modeling the mistake making ourselves is so important so that students see that we're all in this together. And I think that's a great point, Bonnie, too. one of the things that research has shown about that something that diminishes shame is having the sense that we're all in the same boat.
Mhm.
We're all struggling with this. We all make mistakes. And so that is actually a research-based strategy to reduce shame, is to have this sense of we're all in the same boat.
That's great. Thank you. And then Robert mentioned, Robert actually has a couple of questions that we'll get into momentarily, but he mentioned structure support, graphic support, and interactive support. Now he teaches adult ESL. So quite a few of these comments that I'm, excuse me, sharing out are coming from adult ESL teachers. So, and he references several things here. Applying differentiated instruction for our long-term English learners. Yes. Yes, reducing working memory deficit. So all of these things to ensure the conditions are right for learning and making sure that we are providing that space for them to acquire that language. Yes, sentence stems, writing across the curriculum. Absolutely. Robert says, should high school kids rather their teachers in the rate their teachers in the same way that college students do with their professors? Oh, wow.
Yes.
You think so? Okay.
I think that, I think in general, I mean, there's obviously different approaches you take depending on, you know, the stage of education or whatever in the way, but absolutely no one knows teaching better than students. No one knows good teaching better than students. No one knows bad teaching better than students. So our students are, you know, a great source of information and knowledge about good teaching and what good teaching looks like. And, you know, the way that we facilitate those reviews may look different in a high school setting than in a college setting. There's a lot of factors, obviously, that, you know, getting feedback from parents, but I think feedback from the students is so important. We obviously want feedback from the parents, but it's the student that is experiencing the teacher on a daily basis. And those students, they know what's up. They know what good teaching looks like. They know who cares about them, you know, and they know what bad teaching looks like, and they know what's not helpful. And so I do think, you know, we need to listen to our students. The approach may be a little bit different in how we solicit the feedback, but we need to solicit the feedback for sure.
Great question, Robert. Now, Sari says, I work with incarcerated adults, many who have experienced shame while in K-12, and it requires a relearning process to reduce shame and create trust in a learning environment and with the teacher. Wow, kudos to you. You're doing great work out there.
Yeah, and I want to say that is an area of research I'm looking in the future to get into, is looking at folks who have struggled in the criminal justice system, who you know, maybe people who've dropped out of school or not continued their education. There's areas that I definitely want to look at, and I know there are a lot of folks out there that fall into these categories that have suffered a lot of shame, and not just in the school setting, but in general in life. And I think that's definitely a pattern that's out there, and something that I definitely want to look into in the future in my personal research.
All right, we have a couple more questions to get to, but before we do, let me just take the screen share back here and give everybody a quick reminder that we're going to be taking a little bit of a break. We will return in July with our summer webinar series. I know everybody is ready to take a few weeks off and unplug for a little bit. So we're gonna do that with you when it comes to the webinars. But don't forget our new decodable text for tweens, Go Decode, is available. We did a webinar on this a few months back, and that will be on our YouTube channel. But if you do have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, and I can send you samples if you'd like. We're very excited that this one is now available, so check it out. And while we are addressing these last few questions, if you could, because we had such a wide variety of attendees joining us today, and I noticed that our attendees who work with adult learners were, I think, a bigger share of the comments than normal. So it's interesting to me that those who are working with adults are making those connections and seeing those connections with what you've shared. So I'm interested in the connections that our other attendees are making with it, and depending on what it is you teach, if you're a literacy coordinator, reading teacher, if you teach multilingual learners, wondering what your biggest takeaway is from this. And while you're thinking about that and putting that in the chat, let's circle back to some of these questions. So Robert wants to know, he says, in the college and adult ed world, students may feel shame due to being academically unprepared, fear of failure, or lack of reading, writing, and math. Have you ever done this type of research with at-risk adult college students who are young adult or mature adults? Or has everything been done in K-12 with your work?
No, primarily I've been working with college students. And one of the reasons is early on in my research and looking at this is that, and one's ability to communicate what it is they're feeling, to identify what they're feeling as shame, that it takes someone a little bit older to do that. It's very difficult for young children to identify the feeling as one of shame. And so when I go and collect the stories, I'm primarily collecting these stories from college students, which is why I said earlier, one of the other areas of research that I want to get into is looking at people who aren't in college, who didn't make it to college, had a break in that relationship with education in some way, shape, or form. So research shows that children, it's really a retrospective look at what happened to you in school, where that allows you to identify shame as the emotion that you felt. I don't know if that makes sense, but so I've primarily been working with college students and their stories of school-induced shame. But it's important too. You have to almost, I usually do a little mini lecture on what we mean by shame and what shame is, because sometimes people conflate other emotions with shame, and that's commonplace. I've even read books where people are talking about what is actually guilt and calling it shame. And there's a whole area of research around the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is when we feel that we've done something wrong, that our action doesn't align with our ethics or morality. Shame is where we feel the essence of who we are is wrong, that there's something wrong with us. And that is very different. I can feel a high level of self-worth because I don't suffer from much shame, but I may feel very bad about something I did or said to my sister. And that is guilt. And, it's a very different emotion. There's a whole group of researchers that look at the difference. And I think you have to really, in order to have people talk about their shame experiences, they need to understand what is meant by shame and the difference between shame and other things that people tend to conflate with shame.
Wow.
So that's why primarily I've been working with college students. As
you're talking, like, well, that makes complete sense. Like, how would you even have this conversation with a fourth grader? Like
and they do feel the shame. It's just hard for them to identify it as shame. It's easier for older people to talk about it. It's really kind of sad. I mean, this research, it's sort of sad in a way, because I'm collecting these stories, and when I'm reading through, sometimes I'm reading what people are communicating. I usually collect written narratives from folks, and then I go on and interview people, select people based on the narratives, and who've offered to speak with me. And sometimes I do focus group follow-ups. But one of the interesting things is when I'm collecting the shame narratives, a lot of times the narratives, they're not really shame, so they're not usable. But then so many of them are, and it's like good for the research, but terrible. Do you know what I mean? It's a very, it's a double-edged sword. But there's so many people that experience differing levels of shame, and some people that the stories are just horrific and really sad. And, and I know those of you listening or that are going to listen, either you have experienced it, or people have experienced shame in a school setting. And, everybody has heard a story. Everybody knows someone, or you are someone who's experienced shame in a school setting. It's just something that we need to talk about. And The other interesting thing about shame as an emotion, and anyone else who has experience with, like, I know we have a school psychologist with us today, or anybody else who's listening can chime in, but shame is actually one of the emotions has historically been the least researched, because I think it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about.
Yeah.
And it's at the root of a lot of our societal issues. We've got issues with shame around abuse, issues with shame about sexuality and gender issues, and the way our society treats people. And I think shame is at the root of a lot of our ills and the violence that we see in our society. And it's, but people, we were late to come to talking about shame. It really wasn't until the 1970s when people started investigating shame. And that's really late in the game. So we have catching up to do.
For sure. We did have a comment here. Bonnie says there's shame in asking for help. And Sari says it's uncomfortable to talk about because educators have to acknowledge their role in creating it. She also said that it plays a role in the school to prison pipeline. Now, I got to be honest with everybody. When I scheduled this webinar, I didn't know we were going to be going this deep. So we could talk about this for hours. At the same time, it's like you said, it's a little heavy. It's a little heavy to talk about, but it's important. So I'm glad we're here and we're having this conversation. And Karen, I'm glad that you are joining us and that you're finding this valuable. Now, to switch gears a little bit. Now, who was it who said, oh, it's Neri. Hi. So she says for her own high school English as a second language class. The students encourage each other and celebrate by clapping and positive reinforcement when students succeed or are shy to try. She says, my class is a safe place, or so I try. And this is an interesting point because for other attendees who are joining us today who teach a class of newcomers or English learners or multilingual learners, is this perhaps a situation that Dr. Monroe said this is a same boat situation. If we're all new to the language and we're all learning the same thing and we're all going to be essentially starting in roughly the same place, which is not exactly accurate, but does that, would there be a trend then that some of our ESL classrooms would be more likely to be places of pride because we have more of a same boat situation going on? It's an interesting thought. Okay, thank you for sharing that. Bonnie, I agree, such an important conversation. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes and 2 more questions, and then we will wrap it up. So Robert dropped this question in here at about 20 minutes in, and I think this is related to what we were talking about with teachers and being aware sometimes of how some of their interactions land with students when we were talking about insensitivity and hostility. He asks, are you in favor of a personality enhancement training such as body language and voice tone from Albert Moravian communication model? I'm not familiar with that particular model, but this one is apparently 7% verbal, 38% voice tone, and 55% body language. Like would a very specific training like that be helpful?
I am not familiar with that. So I don't even know if I can speak to it.
Yeah.
I do think any kind of training is good when we're talking about working with teachers to think about how they're saying things. I mean, I can't speak to that particular type of training. Sorry, Robert. I'm just not familiar with it, so I wouldn't want to speak to it. But I do think any sort of training where we become self-aware as teachers about how we're saying something, what we're doing. And, teachers, we're so stressed. We have the time constraints. We have the constraints of the content we're supposed to be teaching. We have the constraints of standardized testing. We have the constraints of pressure from parents or administrators or whatever it is, that we're not perfect. We're certainly not perfect, and we're not going to be perfect, and we're going to make mistakes. And like in anything in life, when you add stress to the situation, we're not always our best selves. And so that happens with teachers. So I think any kind of training that supports teachers in working on that and working on managing stress and having being conscientious of how we're saying things and what we're doing and how things can be perceived by kids is really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And last question that we have currently in the Q&A, unless a couple more pop in the next couple of minutes. Laura wants to know, what is the percentage of students who feel shame in the classroom? Is there a way to quantify that?
I don't know that through my research, I don't know that I can quantify that as like cast a big net like that. What I can tell you is just with the shame narratives that I collect, like I'll go into, for instance, an English 101, like a basic English a writing comp course for college freshmen, let's say. So we're looking at, a lot of students. And so, I'm seeing a pretty good percentage that are telling me things that are shame related. Now I'll get some that aren't shame, like I talked about, but, I don't know that I can say a percentage, or I don't have enough, I don't know that anyone can say a percentage. I will just tell you that, more often than not, what people are describing is shame. It's just that sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's also sort of on a scale. I mean, like we said, everyone's going to experience shame at some point or another. Sometimes people's experiences are repeated or toxic in nature. And so you almost want to say it's on a more severe side of the scale. And so I think there's a scale. So I think everyone's going to experience shame at some point or another. But is it toxic and repeated? And that's where it becomes dangerous. And that's why I think the struggling reader situation is unfortunately ripe for shaming, because of our reliance on reading and the need to use that skill all the time and in other contexts. And so I can't put a percentage on it. I can just say that everyone's going to experience shame, and it just depends on the severity. Mm-hmm. But I think you can see, like, I can't remember who it was that shared that they work with in the criminal justice, or work with folks that are incarcerated, and just the how many people that are suffering from shame or have had experiences with shame in their past. Mm-hmm. I think it's commonplace, unfortunately.
And then a final thought here, Melissa chimed in that her school has added a feelings curriculum to the preschool and kindergarten classes to begin training the teachers and giving children emotion vocabularies. And I think we see this, I know SEL instruction is sort of a kind of an umbrella term. There's lots of different ways SEL is approached, but I was thinking of that as you were presenting the connection with this topic and social emotional. And I believe Robert brought it up too in the chat, that giving language around emotions and opening up the floor to discussing the feelings around the learning, that in some ways falls into that category of social and emotional as well, creating that safety. So would you agree that there's a connection there? And is it fair to call it social and emotional learning?
I think it is fair to call it that. And I think that's great. I love to hear about that kind of curriculum, especially working with students early on, learning a vocabulary, learning how to talk about it. As someone said earlier, modeling, having the teacher model how to talk about it, talk about our emotions, talk about what we're feeling, being very specific. I love that idea about teaching specific vocabulary. A lot of times it's hard for students to express what they're feeling. Like I said earlier, it connects back to that, why I work with with college students to talk about shame. So it's really important. I love to hear that folks are working with young children, teaching them about emotions and giving them a vocabulary and the permission to talk about it, which I think is really important. And hopefully those teachers are also modeling that, as we talked about before.
Great questions, everybody. Great engagement. And as we wrap up, I just want to, of course, thank Dr. Monroe, but thank our audience as well, because it's through your engagement and through your loyalty and dedication to joining us for these webinars that we are able to branch out and have these conversations that maybe seem a little bit unexpected, but are really important at the end of the day. So we thank you for your engagement, and without you, we we wouldn't have a webinar series. So we appreciate your participation, and we hope you have a nice, relaxing few weeks off, and you'll join us back in July when we start up again. Thanks, Robert. Thank you, Bonnie, so much. Thank you, Anne. We appreciate that you took the time to be here with us today. This has been a really great conversation. I think you've given us all quite a bit to think about, and we appreciate you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
This is where you can find Saddleback online. You can just use the phone and call us too. If you're old school like that, we like that. We answer the phone. And this is where you can find all of your high-low books. And we, again, thank you for your participation. And we hope you have a great break, and we'll see you in July. Thanks, Dr. Monroe. Thank you, everybody. Take care.